Welcome to episode 99 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's February 7, 1965. We're in Ghana, in Accra, at the end of something brand new, a continental club competition for Africa. Today it's called the CAF Champions League, but in 1965 it's the very first African Cup of Champions Clubs, a tongue-twister tournament still finding its feet, still fighting distance, cost and politics, and still daring to imagine that African club football could have a crown of its own. And the first club to wear it is Oryx Douala of Cameroon, beating Stade Malien of Mali 2-1. This is not just a final, it's an origin story. But how did we get here? Because before Africa could have club kings, it first had to build a football continent. The African Confederation, CAF, is founded in 1957, the same week the Africa Cup of Nations is born. A few national teams, a few federations, and a big idea. Africa should not be a guest in world football. Africa should be a co-author. You might recall that we touched upon this in episode 82. But national teams are only half the picture. The real heartbeat of football lives in clubs, in weekly crowds, local identities, and domestic champions who want to measure themselves beyond their borders. So in late 1963, at a CAF General Assembly in Accra, the decision is taken. Africa will have its own, quote, European Cup, a champions-only competition for clubs. And in Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-African moment, the symbolism is impossible to miss. And the first edition is often remembered under a second name, the Kwame Nkrumah Cup. Now comes the hard part, turning a visionary idea into a playable tournament. How do you do a continental cup in the 1960s, across a continent of enormous distances, limited flights, fragile budgets, and political borders that have only recently been drawn? CAF's answer is pragmatic. The inaugural competition begins with zones, West, Central, and East, and it relies on domestic champions entering, traveling, and surviving the logistics. 14 clubs take part. Some tie their opponents. Because there's no away goals rule, they replay. Some clubs will draw entirely, because a two-legged tie across thousands of kilometers can be as much a financial gamble as a sporting one. It's raw, it's imperfect and fragile, but it's real. And out of that chaos, two clubs make it all the way to Ghana for the final tournament, and then all the way to the final itself. One from Douala in Cameroon, one from Bamako in Mali. Let's start with the outsiders who refuse to play like outsiders, Oryx Douala. In early 1960s Cameroon, Oryx are a power, champions, cup winners, and a club with momentum. They arrive in this competition with goals in their boots and believe in their boss. In the central zone, they survive a wild tie against CS Imana, winning 5-4 on aggregate. And then they walk into Ghana to face the host, real Republicans, in front of a massive crowd. And within 2 minutes, they're behind. A Ghanaian goal, a home search, 50,000 people. This is the moment where the story is supposed to end for the visitors. But it doesn't. Oryx settle, breathe, and start playing. Walter Ebele equalizes. Then Epete makes it 2-1, and the hosts are out. Oryx Douala are in the final of the very first African Cup of Champions Clubs. Waiting for them, Stade Malien. Stade Malien are a different kind of story. Mali is newly independent. Its domestic league is still young. Its football identity is still forming. But Stade Malien are built like an institution, and they bring two things that travel well: discipline and a star. Salif Keita is the tournament's top scorer, a name that will soon become continental royalty, and later European too. Stade Malien don't stroll to the final. They survive a 4-4 aggregate tie that requires a replay. They play a semi-final against Ethiopia's Cotton Factory Club that goes to extra time, ends level, and forces another replay. 2 days later, they win it. And now the final is set. Cameroon versus Mali. Douala versus Bamako. Oryx versus Stade Malien. A first continental title that neither country has ever held, because no one has. That takes us to February 7, 1965, Accra, and the match begins with the tension you'd expect from pioneers: caution, contact, nerves, and the feeling that nobody wants to be remembered as the team that almost won the first one. Then, just before halftime, history picks a name: Emmanuel Koum. He scores for Oryx. It's the opening goal in the first final of what will become Africa's biggest club competition, a small detail that becomes enormous with time. Oryx lead 1-0. In the second half, they strike again. Walter Ebele, already the semi-final hero, makes it 2-0. At that moment, it feels like the first African champions are about to run away with it. But finals rarely allow clean endings. Stade Malien push back hard, and later on, Tiemoko Sinate pulls one back. Now it's 2-1, and every clearance feels like a life decision. Stade Malien throw bodies forward, Oryx drop deeper, and Africa's first club crown suddenly hangs on minutes that feel like hours. But Oryx hold. The whistle goes, and a club from Douala becomes the first champion of Africa. So what, you may ask? If you zoom out, this match is a snapshot of African football at a turning point. This is the 1960s, independence movements, new flags, new federations, new ambitions. And football is not just entertainment, it's national identity, regional pride, and continental symbolism. That's why this trophy matters, because once you crown a champion, you create a tradition. And once you create a tradition, you create a map. From this point on, the African Cup of Champions Clubs becomes a proving ground, sometimes chaotic, sometimes interrupted by withdrawals and replays and costs, but persistent enough to survive. Over time, the competition stabilizes, it grows, it professionalizes. It eventually becomes the CAF Champions League, a modern tournament with group stages, television money, and clubs that build squads specifically to win it. And with that comes another shift, global recognition. African champions begin to matter not just in Africa, but in the wider ecosystem, in intercontinental cups, in Club World Cup formats, and in global player markets. And here's where a beautiful coincidence returns us to the match itself. Remember that first goal scorer, Emmanuel Koum? He's not just a name in a match report from 1965. His career becomes a bridge between early African club glory and African football's growing connection to Europe. In 1967, he transfers to France, to Grenoble, where he crosses paths with Albert Berthoud, the legendary French coach. If that name rings a bell, it should. Just 3 days ago, in episode 96, we talked about Berthoud's Stade Reims, European Cup finalists, and one of the great sides of the 1950s. Now, just a few episodes later, Berthoud reappears in this African story, linked to the man who scored the first goal in this tournament's first final. And how about this statistical quirk? In 1970, just 1 day shy of 5 years after Koum wrote history with scoring the first ever goal in a final for African clubs, he adds another page by scoring Cameroon's first ever goal in an AFCON finals match, as he overwhelmingly contributes to his country's 3-2 win against Ivory Coast after being down 2-0 at halftime in Cameroon's AFCON debut. But connections, that's the hidden engine of the 1960s and 70s. Coaches moving, players exporting, scouts watching, and pathways opening. And it's not just individuals, it's clubs too. Because if you look at these two finalists today, the arc is revealing. Stade Malien endure. They remain one of Mali's major clubs, recurring in continental competition and domestic honors. Oryx Douala, on the other hand, becomes something closer to a memory, pioneers whose timing put them at the top first, but whose era did not last. That's football's cruelty. Being first does not guarantee being permanent, but being first does guarantee something else, immortality. The first African Cup of Champions Clubs is not remembered because it had the biggest crowd, the biggest stars, or the cleanest football. It is remembered because it was the beginning. A continent that had already decided it deserved a voice in world football now decided it deserved a champion too. And on a February afternoon in Ghana, that idea became real, with a 2-1 scoreline, a first trophy, and a first goal scorer whose name still fits perfectly inside the origin story. 3 things to take away. First, continental football doesn't start with fame, it starts with institutions. CAF created a framework, and clubs created the reality by showing up, traveling, and playing. Second, in early African football history, logistics are part of tactics, replays, withdrawals, zones, travel. This competition didn't just test who was best, it tested who could survive the continent. And third, first is its own kind of legacy. Oryx Douala didn't build a modern dynasty, but they built a permanent footprint, the first champions of Africa. On this day in 1965, Oryx Douala beat Stade Malien 2-1 in Ghana to win the first African Cup of Champions Clubs, to give African club football its original crown. That's all for episode 99 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. Tomorrow, in episode 100, February 8, 2000, Inverness Caledonian Thistle at Celtic, and a cup upset that produced one of football's immortal newspaper headlines. I promise that you don't want to miss that one. See you then.